My name is Charles Ziegler. I'm the director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. I am new to the, relatively new to the Grawemeyer Award. I just became director in July, but I was in on the formation of it years ago when Charlie Grawemeyer came to us with his idea of creating an award that would reward and encourage ideas which might in some way improve world order. That is what our award is all about. Let me tell you a little bit about it, and then I will introduce to you our 2012 winner, Dr. Severine Autesserre. The World Order Award is, as far as we know, the largest award in political science or international relations or world order, for that matter, the largest in the world. The winner goes through a long process. We get a large number of submissions every year. Most of these are books, some are articles, and then those get farmed out for review to experts, generally in this country, sometimes abroad, who review them, write up a critique, and tell us whether or not the book or the article really has some merit and could be a contender for the award. Then the Department of Political Science has a committee of specialists who look at all these reviews and go over them. We have several different meetings, usually in the spring of each year. And out of those, we win about the best ones and come up with about 7 or 8 of really the top entries. Then we convene what we call a distinguished international jury of very top people, policymakers. They may have been ex-ambassadors, diplomats. We have someone who was born from outside the United States to give us a different perspective, and then generally an academic. And they take the 7 or 8 and narrow those down to usually 3, and they may recommend a winner. And then there is one more committee after that, which includes representatives of the president of the university, the dean, the chair of the political science department, and 3 to 4 lay people from the Louisville community. And Charlie Grawemeyer was adamant that the award should go to entries that were readable, that were understandable by average educated people, something that was not too heavily technical. And so this committee then looks at what the international jury has recommended and makes a decision. In this case, I have to say that it was really, I can't say it was unanimous, but it was certainly very strong throughout every level of the process that Dr. Autesserre's book, The Trouble with the Congo, Local Violence and the Failure of International Peacebuilding, which was Cambridge University Press, published in 2010, was a very, very strong entry. And I'm very happy about that. Before I do the introduction, I just want to recognize some people. We do have some members of Charlie Grawemeyer's family here. Would you mind standing, please? Please give them a round of applause. I also would like to recognize Dr. Roger Payne, who ran this award for 17 years and did a superb job in bringing it to national and international prominence. Roger. And also Jessica Kincaid, who, like me, came in, just started this process, but who's been instrumental in helping it run smoothly. There's a lot that's involved. Jessica. And now I've got the distinct pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Severine Autesserre. I have gotten to know her well over the past several days. We were just at the International Studies Association conference together about a week ago in San Diego. And then I've had a chance to have lunch and dinner with her and her husband here in Louisville. And she's a delightful person, but we're giving the award for her ideas. And the ideas, which she will tell you about, are really remarkable. As I said, she's assistant professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's also affiliated with the Salzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at Columbia and the Institute of African Studies. She has done extensive field research in Central Africa, So she is not a scholar who just sort of sits at her computer and looks at news articles or something like that. She gets into the field and has been, I think, in some fairly difficult situations, but has managed to come through that. She's been a consultant to Doctors Without Borders and to Action Against Hunger, both very important NGOs in the humanitarian field. Dr. Autesserre is a native of Paris, France. She has her baccalaureate from the Sorbonne Institute and also a master's from Sciences Po in France. She also has a master's from Columbia University in International Studies and her PhD from New York University. She's received a number of fellowships to support her research, including from the Guggenheim, Mellon, and Fulbright. So as you can see, she's, although she is young, she is extremely well qualified and certainly well qualified for the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Please give her a good round of applause.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you very much to all of you for coming to this talk. It is a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here and to present my book on the failure of peace building in the Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo is here on the map. And understanding the reasons for the failure of peace building in Congo is critical for any person interested in international politics, international security, and African affairs. The Congolese conflict is the deadliest conflict since World War II. It has caused over 5 million casualties so far. It has destabilized most of Central and Southern Africa for the past 15 years. It is the largest ongoing humanitarian crisis in the world. And the international engagement in the peace process is also noteworthy. The Congo hosts the largest and most expensive peacekeeping mission in the world. It also hosted the first European-led peacekeeping mission ever. The International Criminal Court chose Congolese warlords as its first cases ever. And overall, the transition from war to peace and democracy, so from June 2003 to, I would say, December 2006, was a period of massive international influence in Congolese affairs. And so in 2006, when the Congo held the elections that put Joseph Kabila into power, many observers hoped that the end of violence in the region had finally come. The international community lauded the successful organization of these elections as finally an example of successful international intervention in a failed state. And yet, over 1,000 civilians continue to die every day in the eastern Congo. The eastern provinces face massive population displacement and horrific human rights violations on a daily basis. And over the past 5 years, fighting in the provinces of the Kivu and Oriental Province, which I'm going to show you later on the map, fighting there has reignited a full-scale civil and international war. So why did the massive international efforts fail to help the Congo build a sustainable peace and democracy? Answering this question is important not only to understand how to end violence in Central Africa, but also to answer other puzzles of major scholarly and policy significance. Why do so many conflicts that end in negotiated peace agreements lapse back into war after a few years? And why do third-party interventions so often fail to secure a sustainable peace? Recent work in comparative politics suggests a preliminary answer. The continuation of violence during peace implementation is at least partly driven by local agenda. And when I say local, I really mean at the level of the individual, the family, the clan, the municipality, the district, sometimes the ethnic group. So why then do interveners so often neglect the local causes of peace process failure. And in the Congo, why did foreign peace builders succeed in imposing a settlement at the national and international levels, but not at the subnational level? The existing academic and policy answers to this question are of two kinds. Well, let's say that first, the almost no analysis of peace implementation studies the importance of local preconditions for peace settlements. But still, we can infer two ideas to understand why international peace builders choose poor peace building strategies. The first is that international peace builders may do their best to establish peace, but economic, political, legal, security, or contextual constraints may impair an adequate treatment of the problem at the root of the violence. Second, vested economic, political, security, or institutional interests may lead some peace builders to consciously ignore violations of the peace agreements. So, do these explanations truly account for peace-building failure? Well, what I found when studying the Congo is that, of course, constraints and interests do matter. But even more importantly, the dominant peace-building culture shapes intervention in a way that precludes action on local violence. And ultimately, that dooms the international peace efforts. Western and African diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, and the staff of most non-governmental organizations involved in conflict resolution share a set of ideologies, rules, rituals, assumptions, definitions, and standard operating procedures. This common culture influences the interveners' understandings of the causes of violence, the path toward peace, and the role of foreign actors. It enables international peace builders to ignore the micro-level foundations necessary for sustainable peace. Regarding the international intervention in the Congo, the presence of this peace-building culture explains why the massive international peace-building efforts have not yet targeted local conflicts, and therefore why the international intervention has failed to help the Congolese state build a sustainable peace. So in this presentation, I will briefly develop this argument, and I'm of course very happy to give you more details afterward during the discussion, if you're interested. And this is how I'll proceed in this talk. I will start by very briefly presenting my research methodology. And then I will present the dominant understanding of the Congolese conflict. And this dominant understanding focuses on national and international causes of violence. And I will explain where this understanding comes from. I will then present how international interveners approach this violence and which strategies they use to end it. And again, I will identify the cultural elements at the root of this strategy. I will then move on to a different and complementary analysis of violence, one that emphasizes the critical role of local conflict and their potential to reignite the national and international war. And after that, I will explain why the few advocates of bottom-up conflict resolution have failed to convince their colleagues to revise their strategy in a way that takes into account the critical role of bottom-up conflicts. In my work, the label international peace builders refers to all actors, persons, countries, organizations, who aim, at least in part, to build peace in the Congo. In terms of violence, I consider only its most obvious form: physical violence against individuals or groups of people. In my analysis, I focus on the period demarcated as a transition from war to peace and democracy, So again, from June 2003 to December 2006. Because during the 3.5 years, international actors exerted an unusually strong influence on Congolese affairs. And therefore, it is the best time period to study the international intervention. But you will see that the analysis that I developed today is actually still very relevant to analyze what's going on in the current period of time. My research methodology has been to alternate fieldwork in the Congolese capital, Kinshasa, and in these towns and villages that are indicated here on the map. And this research design enabled me to contrast my first-hand observation of what was going on in the Eastern Congo with data that showed how diplomats and international interveners based in headquarters and national capitals perceived the situation in the Eastern Congo. So in terms of data, I draw on 3 kinds of sources. Field observations that I conducted in Kinshasa and in the Eastern Congo between 2001 and 2007. More than 330 interviews that I conducted with Congolese political, military, diplomatic, civil society actors, with victims of violence, with perpetrators of violence, with foreign diplomats, staff of international and non-governmental organizations, and foreign observers in the Congo, France, Belgium, the United States, and South Africa. And finally, I also drew on document analysis, policy documents, confidential sources, non-governmental organization and United Nations report, and of course, news sources. So, how did the international interveners understand the Congolese conflict? Well, the first cultural element that I'd like to emphasize is that UN staff and diplomats, along with most other international interveners, are trained to analyze conflict from a top-down perspective. So in the Congo, they identified national and international causes, and they identified especially national and international tensions as the causes of the fighting and massacres in the eastern region. And when I say regional, I really mean at the level of the Great Lakes region. So that would be Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and Congo. And here is the broad picture that they had in mind. The first recent war started in 1996, the second war in 1998. And during those wars, violence, according to them, was caused by the 14 foreign armies present on Congolese territory, and by the 3 main Congolese rebel groups that opposed the Congolese government of President Kabila. In 2003, a settlement was reached at the national and regional levels. Foreign troops officially withdrew from Congolese territory, and normal diplomatic ties resumed between former enemies. Important development also took place at the national level. For example, the official reunification of the country, the formation of a unified government, and an attempt at integrating the different armed groups into a single national army. But during the whole time, massive insecurity persisted in the eastern provinces. So especially in the provinces that you can see in bright red on the map. And in the dominant narrative, regional and national tensions explained why violence continued. The dominant narrative especially emphasized that some of the regional causes of violence persisted during the transition. There were extensive reports of Rwandan involvement in the eastern provinces since the war officially ended. According to Kigali, the main reason for this involvement was that rebel Rwandan Hutu militias were still present in the Congo, And they posed an important threat to Rwanda because they included some of those responsible for the 1994 genocide. According to many sources, Rwanda was actually more interested in pursuing two other goals in the Congo. First, the illegal exploitation of Congolese mineral resources, which remained a very important source of revenue for Rwanda. And second, the protection of the population of Rwandan descent living in the Congo, because the life and status of this ethnic minority has been constantly threatened by Congolese indigenous groups since Congolese independence in 1960. This Rwandan involvement generated violence in two different ways. It kept the Rwandan rebels in the Congo, and you may know that these militias are responsible for widespread and horrific violence on the population of the Kivus. It also caused some Rwandan actors to support Congolese armed groups with arms and funding. Most international interveners also emphasized that at the national level, many sources of violence also persisted after 2003. To start, the president and most former rebel leaders maintained parallel command structures over their soldiers. And they did that in order to keep their territorial control or to weaken their political enemies. So it meant that the army integration process was mostly a failure, and that the government could not extend its authority in the eastern provinces. So as of today, there is still no functioning justice system and no reliable police or army in the eastern provinces. The dominant narrative also focused on another important national cause of violence during the transition, and that was the tensions between most Congolese leaders, including President Kabila, and the representatives of the Congolese with Rwandan ancestry. Almost all of the national leaders who did not belong to this ethnic minority used propaganda against the Congolese population of Rwandan descent as a way to rally supporters. And these hate speeches led to many abuses against this minority. According to virtually all international interveners, in addition to these political motivations, national economic agendas sparked a lot of violence. National factions remained involved in the illegal exploitation of natural resources, and it generated violence amongst armed groups who fought for the control of mining sites, as well as violence against the local population to get people to conduct the mining operations. In the dominant narrative, the last important national cause of violence was that a lot of the funds for the army were diverted. And this reinforced the soldiers' tendency to prey on the population, which meant stealing and usually beating, raping, torturing, or even killing those who refused to comply. But then international interveners could not relate all instances of violence to these national or regional tensions. So they used several interrelated frameworks of analysis to understand non-macro-related violence. And in their view, local violence was private and criminal, and it was the consequence of the lack of state authority in the Congo. Most importantly, foreign actors believed that violence was innate to the Congo. Most international actors I met pictured the Congo as an inherently turbulent country where violence was normal and to be expected. And it is important to note here that this image of the so-called Congolese inherent savagery is in fact a construct that the Belgian colonizers have constructed and promoted during the 19th century in order to facilitate colonization, and that has persisted up to now. This broad understanding of violence shaped the international intervention in the Congo, but it was not the only element. UN officials, diplomats, non-governmental officials also shared three other beliefs that shaped their views of what constituted the most appropriate type of foreign intervention. To start, international actors perceived themselves as facing multiple, almost unsurmountable constraints. They especially complained about the constraints posed by the environment, such as the collapsed state, the security and logistical problems, and the domestic availability of valuable, easily marketable commodities, such as gold and cassiterite. These obstacles could have been overcome if peace builders had had massive funding and numerous, well-qualified human resources at their disposal. However, peace builders always complained of material constraints. And the United Nations peacekeeping mission, the MONUC, was the most affected, especially in terms of lack of staff and poor quality of the people deployed to the field. And my interviewees always said that all of these constraints severely limited their peace-building options. As a result, they had to prioritize. And two other shared dominant understanding oriented which strategy took precedence. To start, international interveners conceptualized the intervention as exclusively concerned with the national and regional realm. This macro-level focus is a central part of the very identity of international organizations and diplomatic missions. And in the 20th century, it was reinforced by the norm of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of a sovereign state. So as a result, diplomats and United Nations staff members are socialized in working at the macro level. They believe that working at these levels is the natural, the only legitimate thing for them to do. And they usually have no training in working at the local level or in analyzing local tensions. The last cultural element that oriented the broad intervention strategy is that from June 2003 until, I would say, late 2008, international actors labeled the Congo as a post-conflict situation. And this label brought about a change of strategy for most peace builders. Since the Congo was not at war anymore, subnational actors could not be conceptualized as rebels or warring parties anymore. The Congolese actors who participated in the transition became the only legitimate partners for diplomats and UN staff. The actors who continued to wage violence and who refused to participate in the transition were labeled illegal, and therefore diplomats and UN staff were not supposed to meet with them. So at that point, mediation between different combatants was not an option anymore because at least one of the parties was considered illegitimate. And the three shared understandings set the preconditions for the choice of a peace and state building strategy concerned almost exclusively with elections. And as you know, reconstructing a state entails many measures. For example, rebuilding a bureaucracy, a justice system, effective and disciplined coercion forces, and also selecting appropriate leaders. Well, in Congo, from 2003 until late 2007, the international actors have focused all of their financial, human, and logistic resources on only one of these tasks, the selection of leaders through elections. And again, we can easily locate the reasons for this focus in the ideological environment of the post-Cold War era. Building democracy has now become equated with holding elections. And all major international peace-building bureaucracies see election as a workable, appropriate, and effective tool for state and peace building. Therefore, throughout the transition, diplomats and UN staff members focused almost all of their limited resources on organizing general elections. They saw other state and peace-building tasks as secondary priorities that anyway they had to approach in a top-down fashion. And there was only one exception to this top-down approach, and that was humanitarian and development aid. Aid workers constantly interact with local leaders and local actors in order to conduct their daily tasks. And international interveners perceived this specific kind of subnational involvement as perfectly legitimate and perfectly respectful of the sovereignty of the Congolese state, because they viewed relief and humanitarian aid as apolitical and technical. And again, we have to note that this image of relief aid as technical, neutral, and apolitical is in fact a construct that the aid workers have constructed and propagated and promoted during the 20th century in order to facilitate their action. So overall, the intervention strategy focused on the macro level and especially on organizing general elections. General elections were held in 2006, and these elections officially marked the successful completion of the transition from war to peace and democracy. But extensive violence persisted in the eastern provinces, so around here. And as I mentioned before, in 2008, we were back to a full-scale civil and international war. So why did the international intervention fail? Well, there are many reasons, such as this exclusive focus on elections. While we know that elections organized shortly after the end of a civil war usually fuel violence rather than promoting peace and democracy. There is also the lack of attention to security sector reform and to the rebuilding of the justice system, and the insufficient diplomatic pressure on foreign and Congolese elite so that they stop fueling violence on the ground. But the one crucial reason that people usually fail to mention is the international neglect of local tensions. Because it is true that there were clear national and regional causes for the continuation of violence during the war, during the transition, even now. But contrary to the dominant narrative, the ongoing conflict is also motivated by distinctively local causes of violence. In other words, violence in the Congo is not purely a consequence of the regional and national tensions. And we can identify several distinctively local causes of violence that are not related at all to criminality or barbarism. First, there were important social motivations in being part of a militia and in continuing to wage violence. Lack of social opportunities, and the fact that being a member of a militia, or even better, being the leader of a militia, was the best way for the uneducated and the disenfranchised to claim a social status that the traditional order denied them. Another social motivation was the threat of retaliation against those suspected of having wronged their neighbors and collectivities during the war. Political issues were key as well in generating conflict. There was a lot of competition at the village or district level over who could be chief of village, chief of district, chief of territory, who was the highest ranked individual, family, or ethnic group. And this kind of conflict had existed all throughout Congolese history, but the war added yet another layer of complexity. Now, on the top of everything was a competition between traditional authorities and the authorities put in war by the different warring parties, put in place by the different warring parties. And there was also a lot of conflict over who could be appointed to local administrative positions. And all this kind of conflict led to political violence many times throughout the transition. These political tensions usually interfaced with economically motivated hostilities because political power guaranteed access to land and resources, while access to resources meant the availability of funds that would help secure troops and arms and then help secure political power. And the economic competition usually revolved around two key sources of wealth in the Congo: land and mineral resources. So people talk a lot about the illegal exploitation of natural resources and how it motivated a lot of violence and fighting. But the stakes of land distribution are similarly extremely high. Land provides the main means of survival to rural Congolese families, and it is the primary way of integration into the local social structures. So for centuries, there has been a lot of small and large-scale fighting that had at their core the distribution of land, and this continued during the transition. And these economic and political issues often motivated local alliances with the Rwandan rebels, the Rwandan Hutu militias. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because the dominant narrative usually presented Rwandan rebels as a purely regional issue, saying that the Rwandan militia stayed in Congo and waged violence on the population, mostly because they could not go back to Rwanda. So they preyed on the Congolese population, and the Congolese were helpless victims. Well, it's true, but it's not the entire story. In my fieldwork, I actually discovered that the Rwandan Hutus were not purely predatory militia. They did have a lot of local support from grassroots militias, from soldiers and local commanders in the National Integrated Army, and from local administrative authorities. And these local alliances were key to perpetuating the Rwandan rebels' presence on Congolese territory and the violence associated with it. Without local allies, the Rwandan rebels would not have been able to defend themselves against their enemies. They would not have been able to trade with the local populations. And they would not have been able to access the mining resources that they used to buy arms and continue fighting. And similarly, the dominant narrative presents the problems with the population with Rwandan ancestry as a purely national or regional issue. But again, they were an important local component in this ethnically motivated violence. Local issues around land and traditional power were at the root of the ethnic tensions that developed before the war between indigenous communities and the population of Rwanda descent. And during the transition, the local stakes were similarly very high. There was still a lot of tension around local access to land and to traditional and administrative power by people of Rwandan descent. And it led many times to localized fighting, and very often it escalated into generalized fighting. So, to sum up, during the Congolese transition, violence was motivated not only by the top-down causes, by the national and regional causes, emphasized in the literature and emphasized by policymakers and practitioners, but also by long-standing bottom-up agendas. And there was a constant interaction between the local and the national and regional causes of violence, namely alliances between local leaders and national leaders and regional leaders. But throughout the transition, local actors and local agendas became increasingly self-sustaining and autonomous from the national and regional tracks, most notably in the eastern provinces of the Kivus and Katanga and Ituri. And there, local disputes led to clashes that no national or regional actors could stop, and that in North Kivu eventually jeopardized the national and regional settlements. Therefore, the international intervention should have addressed tension, not only at the national and international levels, but also at the local level. And throughout the transition, there were several attempts at promoting the bottom-up conflict analysis that I just developed. And these attempts came from a few diplomats, the few civilian members of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, the few local peacebuilding organizations present on Congolese territory, as well as many Congolese grassroots activists. And all of these people tried to convince international interveners that they should adopt a bottom-up peacebuilding approach, but they failed. And throughout the transition, there was barely any support to the local peacebuilding initiatives. And that's puzzling, because international interveners could have easily boosted local initiatives with the resources at hand. To minimize the cost and to minimize international interference, donors could have supported local NGOs and civil society representatives with fundings and logistics which grassroots Congolese organizations usually lacked to implement effective bottom-up peace-building programs. And to find the resources to support local conflict resolution, international donors could have either shifted their priorities away from elections or increased their aid budgets. And donors, the United Nations, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations could have focused on two high-priority areas: resolving land conflict and promoting inter-community reconciliation, which would have assuaged a lot of violence and fighting. And in addition, UN officials and diplomats could have considered stepping in to resolve the few political and military problems that grassroots civil society actors were not equipped to address. So, why did the largest peacebuilding bureaucracies reject these opportunities for change? Well, there are two main reasons, which again bring us back to the influence of cultural elements. First, the suggested strategy jeopardized numerous organizational interests. For bureaucracies, such as the United Nations and the diplomatic missions, considering working on local conflicts would have challenged their very identity. Because, as I explained before, their identity centered on the notion that they were macro-level international organizations. It would also have meant embarking on an extensive process of change to create new departments, new standard operating procedures, new funding and operating patterns. And creating all this would have been challenging and time-consuming. The second reason for the failure of reform attempts was that the suggested strategy clashed with deeply entrenched cultural norms, such as the norm of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of a sovereign state, and the deep-seated belief that democracy through elections is the best answer to war and violence. And as a result, there was international intervention at the local level, only in the case of shocking events. In the Congo, 4 kinds of events were so shocking that they overcame the habituation to violence, and they brought about intervention to stop local violence. First, when supposedly peaceful areas suddenly flared up, such as Ituri in 2002. Second, when a crisis looked like a potential genocide, again, such as Ituri. Third, when international peace builders were targeted, such as happened in North Kivu in 2003, in Ituri in 2003, North Kivu in 2006. And finally, when violence was particularly graphic and gruesome, such as the fighting in Ituri or the massacres by Rwandan Hutu militias in the Kivus. And the second kind of element that overcame the habituation to violence was the recognition that an escalating crisis threatened the national and regional settlements. And for each element, the mechanism was similar. It pushed local violence back into the realm of the abnormal. It also illuminated the political, military, economic, and social dimensions of the local conflict. It thus prompted the recategorization of the Congo as a war situation. And therefore, international interveners switched to strategies that were appropriate for war environments. The problem was that these shocking events did not alter the other cultural elements that shaped the intervention strategy. So the intervention was still mostly top-down, and it only brought back the violence to a level that was considered normal for the Congo. And otherwise, in the absence of shocking events, the perception of local conflict resolution as long-term and familiar and as an illegitimate task turned local-level constraints on international action at the local level into unsurmountable obstacles. And this, in turn, reinforced the perception of bottom-up peace-building as a negligible and unmanageable issue. So, what did we learn? And how can people who don't work on the Congo use my analysis? Well, in brief, the book suggests a new theoretical approach to the study of international peace-building failures in the Congo, in the rest of Africa, and elsewhere. The dominant international peace-building culture shapes the interveners' understandings of peace, violence, and intervention in a way that overlooks the micro-level foundations necessary for sustainable peace. The resulting inattention to local conflicts leads to unsustainable peace building in the short term and potential war resumption in the long term. And I show in the book how this analysis can help better understand many cases of international intervention failures in Africa and elsewhere. Local conflicts are usually critically important in sustaining violence in most war and post-war environments, from Darfur to Afghanistan to Iraq. And in the rare cases where there have been comprehensive bottom-up peace-building initiatives, these initiatives have been successful in helping make peace sustainable. And one of the best examples is the contrast that we can see between the relatively peaceful situation in Puntland and Somaliland, which benefited from sustained grassroots peace-building initiative, with the violence prevalent in the rest of Somalia, where peace-building was mostly top-down. And I present in the book several other cases where bottom-up conflict resolution made a critical difference, such as in South Africa and in Northern Ireland. However, I also show in the book that the international peace-building culture regularly precludes intervention at the local level. For example, the dominant peace-building culture shapes the international understanding of violence in a top-down manner, as it did in the Congo. UN officials, diplomats, the staff of most non-governmental organizations usually interpret continued fighting and massacres in places like Darfur, Kenya, or the former Yugoslavia as a top-down problem, meaning as the consequence of national and international tensions. And these international peace builders usually fuel local conflicts as the result of insufficient state authority and of various populations' so-called inherent propensity to violence. And the dominant peace-building culture also usually shapes the international actors' understanding of their roles, as focused on the international and national levels, and in particular on the organization of elections, while diplomats and UN staff members consider local conflict resolution as unimportant and familiar and as an unmanageable task. And I show in the book how this analysis can help understand the international peace-building strategies in places like Afghanistan, Bosnia, Darfur, South Sudan, Haiti, and Kosovo, and Timor-Leste. And of course, I have developed very detailed policy recommendations based on these research findings. And there are about 10 to 15 pages in the book, but I'll take 1 minute now to mention the main idea. The main point is that in addition to any top-down intervention, conflict must be resolved from the bottom up. Again, my argument is not that national and regional tensions don't matter, and that national and regional peace building is unnecessary. Instead, my argument is that both macro-level and micro-level peace building are needed to make peace sustainable. And of course, local NGOs, local authorities, and civil society representatives should be the main actors in the bottom-up process. But there are obstacles. Local actors usually lack the funding, the logistical means, and sometimes the technical capacity to implement effective local peace-building programs. So international interveners should expand the funding available for local conflict resolution. And they should do so either by shifting their priorities away from elections or by increasing their aid budgets. And in the Congo, donors, the United Nations, international and local non-governmental organizations, and Congolese state authorities at all levels should focus on two high-priority areas: resolving land conflict and promoting inter-community reconciliation. Again, this is a very brief summary of my research findings, so I'd be delighted to talk more about any of this during the discussion. Thank you.
Who would like to start? Questions?
A couple of questions which are about related case studies. A couple of questions about related case studies and how you might use your framework to understand them. You mentioned one of them already, which is the example of the contrast between Somalia and Somaliland. One of the things that one of the big contrasts there is that while you have relative peace and stability in Somaliland, the international community still refuses to recognize or acknowledge the independence of Somaliland from Somalia. Mm-hmm. And so you have an ironic situation where you have stability, and yet the international community refuses to recognize that until there is a resolution of the conflict in Somalia. And I wondered what, if anything, your comments might be on that tension then between that failure to recognize something that has been organically produced. And the second case study would be of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. This has been hugely symbolic in the last couple of months. It's become one of the biggest internet phenomenon of the last decade, the Joseph Kony campaign. And how you can take advantage of something that goes global to then develop this local grassroots network, rather than the sort of classic approach, which is the global media puts a spotlight on something, international community then looks at it and then goes to the usual solutions. How local grassroots might take advantage of something like that. I just wondered what your thoughts would be on those two cases.
I'll start with the last question, the Kony 2012 video. Basically, to me, the Kony 2012 video is something that it's one one of these examples of people needing simplistic narrative to make sense of violence and to make sense of a very complex situation. So that's something we saw in the video that was presenting a very simplistic view of the civil war in Uganda and the potential solutions to the war in Uganda. And to me, that's something, we see the same kind of situation in Congo with very simplistic narrative, for example, focused on natural resources, focused on sexual violence that dominate the media. And what local actors are usually telling me in Congo or in other places where they see all the media focusing on this very simplistic story is that not only it's biased and it's inaccurate, but also it's harmful. It actually leads to intervention that worsen the situation at the local level. And that's what my new project, my new research is looking at, is how by framing the situation in this kind of very simplistic term so that we can do fundraising, so that we can have a very nice story in a column, in a newspaper, or so that we can have a 3-minute briefing, then we're shaping interventions in a way that will eventually harm the people that we're trying to help. So how local grassroots can take advantage? Well, it's difficult. The main thing with stories like the Connie 2012 video is that it has attracted attention to Uganda. And now you have more people who are interested, who want to know a bit more about Uganda, or at least it's somewhere on their radar, on their mental radar. So then they can use that. The idea would be for us to use that as an opportunity to educate people about the conflict and to let them know, well, it's not only about Joseph Kony, but it's also about all these other issues. And that's where we can talk about local conflict and enable local actors to actually receive some of the resources and some of the fundraising that will be achieved by this kind of viral videos. On the contrast on Somalia and Somaliland, yes, no, exactly. That's it's part of this entire culture of thinking. Well, we're just gonna deal with the elite, with the people we have recognized who hold the capital city and who hold the central power. And whatever happens in the provinces is not that relevant, as long as it doesn't concern the central power. And so one of the manifestations of this bias toward the international and national level and towards this bias toward the capital city is the failure to recognize progress, any kind of progress that is being made by local level actors like in Somaliland.
Could you elaborate? You said one of your primary recommendations is this, the need to address local land conflicts and inter-community reconciliation. And you said that the international interventions tend to ignore local actors. It seems to me that, particularly in the case of the Congo, before the Congo Wars, you have Mobutu, and you have virtually entire state collapse in Congo. And particularly in the East, people had created civil society organizations. The churches filled in the space left behind by a state that essentially didn't exist. So could you tell us a little bit about which kinds of local actors and what kinds of activities are the ones that should be vital to support? And then connect that up to sort of the inter-community reconciliation question.
Basically, my idea is that it depends on what local actors think is important. So I'm not saying that we as internationals should decide or should think, well, land is the primary issue, so we're gonna focus on land, and we're gonna give all the money to land or to this kind of thing. What I'm saying is that when I was traveling in villages in the Eastern Congo and asking people what's the main problem that you're facing in your daily life, they were always telling me, well, land issue is something, or our tensions with the community next door, with the next village is the primary problem. And then I was asking them, okay, so who is doing good work, or who can help you address these problems? And sometimes they were saying, oh, the priest, the local church leader is doing some good work, or sometimes they were saying, oh, there is this organization that is based in the next village or in the district capital, and they had a really good idea, and they wanted to do something, but they had no money. Or there is, sometimes they were mentioning international NGOs, various actors. So I think the way we can go about it is first decide, okay, local conflict resolution is important. We're going to devote resources, we're going to devote time, we're going to devote funding and resources to this issue, to local conflict resolution. And then have internationals step back. So not having internationals arrive and implement local conflict resolutions themselves, because they wouldn't know. I wouldn't know how to start if I were in a village. You wouldn't know how to start if you arrived in a village in Congo. And it's not by staying 6 months or a year that you can really understand all the ins and outs of the situation. So it's just having representatives of the donors, of the embassies, of the United Nations, of the main NGOs, be in the village, become very, very familiar enough with the situation so that they can gather data on what problems are important to address for each village, for each district, for each province, and who are the actors who have the best chance, the best legitimacy to address these problems. And the local actors, whoever they are, it doesn't matter whether they're local authorities, whether they're local chiefs, whether they're church leader, Muslim leader, anybody who has the legitimacy and who has a good idea on how to address these problems. And then channel the funding, channel the resources to them, and let them decide on the situation. So my answer to your question is, from my research, what I've seen is that people were always talking about land conflict and inter-community reconciliations. And they usually mentioned civil society, religious groups, and civil society organizations as the main actors that help them. But it really varies depending on which village you're working in or which specific areas. So I think we really need to go and to use a case-by-case basis. We can't just have a standard policy recommendation saying, oh, we're going to use the priest in every parish, or we're going to use the local traditional chief in every village.
Does the UN have the manpower and funds to do that, to go to all these villages?
The UN has the manpower already to deploy a lot of people in Congo. There are 20,000 soldiers who are in Congo, and there are thousands of extra civilian peacekeepers. And what I'm saying is that so far they are using a lot of their manpower to try to do things by themselves. Which of course is a huge waste of time because they don't understand anything. And no, it's true. But it's not a criticism. It's impossible to understand something when you go for a 6-month mission in a situation. So they're not very effective. They're extremely costly. So they're using all of the UN resources on things that don't really make a difference. Well, I'm saying that if you change, the peacekeepers most of the time, they're not doing much good to the populations. So instead of having soldiers who basically don't know what they are doing in a Congolese village, if you replace them by people who actually anthropologists, who try to understand the situation, and who channel the resources to people that they know are reliable, then with the same amount of manpower, with the same human resources, then you can make a difference. I'm just arguing for changing the profile of the people that we deploy to the field. We don't necessarily need more people. We need them to do something different.
On a personal level of how you did this research in such adverse conditions, how did you keep yourself relatively safe? Could you spend a moment and tell us what you did on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. I was very careful. At the beginning, I relied on friends who were working for non-governmental organizations. So I followed their security procedures. Meaning not working at night, making sure that everybody always knew where I was, with whom, at what time I was supposed to come back, so that if I did not come back, then people would come and look for me. And also, I spent a lot of time talking to people, making sure that everybody knew what my research was about, and that they knew I was not a threat. And that, for example, when I was working on local violence, I always made sure I told them, I will not identify you by name, so you would not have any personal consequences to worry about. I'm just trying to understand what happens. Same for the victims, etc. So that was one of the main things I did. And then it was just pure luck. So sometimes I was lucky and, I left a place before violence started. Sometimes I was not. And then that's what at the point where I called the United Nations and I said, hi, I'm stuck somewhere, bombs are falling, please come and help me if you have time. And they did. Because I was staying with humanitarian people, and the UN has a mandate to protect humanitarian people. So they came and they got us out and put us in their compound, which means that I'm eternally grateful to the United Nations, and especially the peacekeepers who were in Congo in 2004. But otherwise, it's just, there are a lot of standard security precautions that you can take when you're working in a war situation. And so I was following the standard security measures, and I think I was lucky because given that I've been going to the Congo now, it's been 12 years that I work in Congo, I have people who know me well enough and who know what I'm doing and who appreciate my work. So sometimes I would get a phone call telling me, I know you wanted to go to this village next week, but don't. And so I would just follow their advice, and sometimes they were just scaring me because they wanted to keep me away, but sometimes they were actually protecting me. So I think it worked like that, just networking, making sure that I was as transparent as possible about what I was doing, and just being lucky.